For have you ever stayed awake at night, staring into the dark, and felt like something was staring back at you? Not moving, not breathing, just waiting. Tonight's story begins in a place where time stopped breathing a long time ago. An abandoned hospital in New York, windows shattered like broken teeth, hallways still smelling faintly of disinfectant and decay, and one room still locked, room 606. They say the patient inside never died. And tonight, someone finally opens the door. So lie back, close your eyes, and let your fear fall asleep with you. Hey, you made it. You're exactly where you need to be right now. No rush, no noise. Just you, my voice, and a story that doesn't want to be forgotten. If you enjoy slow, quiet horror that crawls under your skin instead of jumping at your face, go ahead and gently tap subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me keep you company in the dark. All right, let's drift back now. Back to a hospital that should have stayed sealed. Story begins. Calm, observational tone. Dr. Ethan Miller didn't believe in ghosts anymore. Not after what he'd seen in real operating room. Not after the blood, the mistakes, the flat lines that echoed longer than they should. These days, he called himself an urban explorer. But really, he was just a surgeon who couldn't stop walking into dead places. The hospital stood at the edge of the city, swallowed halfway by weeds and fog. No lights, no signs, just concrete bones sticking out of the ground. People said it closed after a fire. Others said it closed after something worse. Miller entered through a collapsed side entrance just after midnight. His flashlight clicked on. Dust floated in the air like slow snow. Every step echoed too loudly. Still standing, he muttered. The hallway signs were still there. Emergency, ICU, psych ward, and one arrow, handwritten in red marker. Miller didn't know why that number made his chest tighten, but it did. The deeper he walked, the colder the air became. Not winter cold, hospital cold. Sterile, unforgiving. His footsteps passed rusted gurneys. Wheelchairs tipped on their sides. Plastic curtains fluttering with no wind. The hospital felt empty, but not unoccupied. His recorder clicked on. Exploration log, level 6, northwest wing. Static cracked. That's when he heard it. A sound, soft, wet, like breathing through fluid. It came from the end of the hall, from room 606. Door to 606, suspense tightens. The door was different. All the others were open, or broken, or missing. But this one was sealed. Metal bars bolted across the frame, chains layered thick, and a warning scratched into the paint. Do not open. Patient still responsive. Miller swallowed. Responsive, he whispered. He lifted his flashlight. Something moved behind the frosted glass. Slow, not walking, dragging. His chest tightened. Then, a knock. From the inside. One slow tap, then another. His hands shook as he touched the chain. You're not real, he whispered. The lock snapped open with a soft, metallic sigh. The door creaked inward. Reveal patient 606. The smell hit first. Old rot, medicine. Something sweet that shouldn't be sweet. The room was dim. Monitors stood frozen in time. An IV pole leaned sideways. Dried fluids streaked the floor like old tears. And on the bed, a body. Patient 606. Skin gray, chest barely rising. Arms strapped down with yellowed restraints. The IV line was torn out. Blood crusted around the wrist. But the body moved, just slightly. Miller stepped closer. That's not possible. The eyes snapped open, completely black. No whites, no reflection, just pits. And when the mouth opened, the voice came out wrong. Dry, shredded, still alive. Why didn't you save me? Miller stumbled back. His flashlight dropped. The beam skidded across the ceiling, came back down, and the face changed. It was older now. Milieu. Scar across the jaw. Surgical scar along the chest. Miller's hands began to tremble. No, that scar. That was his incision. The patient's head tilted. Recognition spread across its ruined face. You promised. Miller's knees weakened. Memory crashed into him like cold water. A night. An emergency surgery. A heart that wouldn't restart. A patient declared dead. Patient 606. He had signed the death certificate with his own hand. But the body on the bed took a breath. The lights flickered. The door behind him slammed shut. The monitor beside the bed suddenly screamed to life, beeping, slow at first, then faster, then panicked. The patient's lips stretched into something that almost resembled a smile, and in a voice that sounded like it came from underwater, it whispered, "You left me here." Awake, the heart monitor flatlined. Room 606 went silent, and in the darkness, something behind Miller began to move. And that is where we'll pause tonight, because what happens next is where the hospital truly wakes up. Sleep easy for now, and when you're ready, we'll return to room 606 together. Miller didn't realize he was holding his breath until his lungs started to burn, and when he finally exhaled, the sound came out shaky and thin, like air leaking from a cracked tire. And for a second, he almost laughed at himself, because why would a grown man who had cut into living people for a living be afraid of an empty room and a flatline monitor and a corpse that wasn't supposed to move anymore? But then the smell shifted again, warm and wet and wrong, and he felt it crawl into the back of his throat, and the humor died quietly as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. And the longer he stood there, the more the room began to feel less like a hospital room and more like the inside of something that was pretending to be one. And he took one slow step backward, then another, testing the floor like it might give way beneath him. And when it didn't, he whispered that soft, nervous kind of whisper people use when they're trying to convince themselves they still have control. And he said, "It's just stress, Ethan. It's just adrenaline. You're not special. You're not in a story. You're just tired and trespassing in a dead building." And if that thought had worked, he wouldn't have noticed that the temperature near the bed was colder than the rest of the room. Not draft cold, but presence cold. The kind that doesn't move and doesn't explain itself. And he wouldn't have noticed that the shadow beneath the bed was darker than the shadow cast by the rest of the room, like it was swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. And he definitely wouldn't have remembered the last time he had stood beside this same patient in a different room under bright surgical lights, with nurses counting instruments and his hands steady as stone, and his mind quiet with focus. Because surgeons live in moments where hesitation means death, and that night the hesitation came anyway, not from him but from the heart that simply refused to listen. And when the monitors went wild and then flat, and the nurse looked at him with that question in her eyes, he had felt something like relief when he called the time of death, because calling it meant it was over, and now standing here again with that same scar staring back at him from dead skin that wouldn't stay dead. He felt the relief crack open into something sour and heavy and personal, and he backed into the hallway without turning around, because some instincts never leave you. And the door creaked but didn't slam. This time it just hung there open, like the room was offering him one slow, polite chance to leave, and he should have taken it. But instead, he lifted his light and aimed it down the hall, and finally saw what his brain had been refusing to name all along, that the hallway had changed. While he was inside the room, the walls sagged inward just slightly, like they were tired. The lights that shouldn't have worked at all flickered with a weak, jaundiced glow, and at the far end where the hospital map said the old psychiatric wing used to be a door, now stood open where it had been sealed in the blueprints he'd studied weeks ago. And even through the distance, he could read the word etched into the peeling paint asylum. And once again, the building gently reminded him that it was not interested in following its own rules. And he took one careful step into the hall, and another, and every meter pulled memory loose from the walls like quiet dust. And he remembered the stories he'd heard in med school about this wing, about patients transferred here when other hospitals couldn't handle them, about experimental treatments that were quietly abandoned, and records that were quietly lost, and lawsuits that never quite went to trial because some witnesses didn't stay sane long enough to testify. And he felt the weight of those half-buried rumors press into his shoulders as he moved, and with each step, the beeping from 606 grew fainter until it sounded less like a machine and more like a distant pulse. And without meaning to, he started matching his breathing to it, slow and slow out, as if staying in rhythm with a dead heart might somehow keep him alive. And when he reached the threshold of the psychiatric wing, he noticed the floor changed from clean cracked tile to stained concrete flecked with old dark marks that time never quite cleaned, and the walls were covered in scratched messages, layers of handwriting over decades, prayers, apologies, names, dates, and occasionally just the word listening, written again and again like an accusation, and the air carried that same sterile hospital chill. But underneath it was something else. Old sweat, old fear, old despair baked deep into the structure. And when he whispered hello into the corridor, the word fell flat, like it didn't know how to echo in a place like this. And for a brief, foolish moment, he considered turning back, ending the exploration, telling himself that even curiosity deserves a boundary. But then the dry humor slipped back in quietly, and he thought, well, you already opened the wrong door tonight, might as well see how wrong it gets. And he moved forward again past rooms with doors hanging open like broken teeth and restraints bolted to walls and rusted beds, bolted to floors as if the building had once been afraid its occupants might float away. And the deeper he went, the more the temperature dropped, until his breath began to miss faintly in his light, and his fingers went numb around the flashlight handle. And then he heard it again, that same wet breathing sound, not behind him this time, but ahead and slightly above. And when he tilted the beam upward, he saw the ventilation grate trembling just a little, as if something on the other side was leaning close enough to make it shake. And he didn't run, because surgeons don't run. They observe, they assess, and they make decisions with consequences attached. And his decision in that moment was to keep walking, because whatever was in the walls was already closer to him than he liked, and running would only turn him into prey instead of a witness. And when he reached the central observation room of the wing, he found the old master logbook lying open on a metal desk, its pages yellowed and stuck together with age, and something darker. And he slowly separated them until one name caught the beam of light and made his stomach drop. Not a patient's name, not at first, but his own handwritten in old ink beside a consultation date from over a decade ago, back when he was just a resident and thought the world still obeyed systems. And he flipped the page with shaking fingers and saw the patient number 606 listed again. Not as a surgical case this time, but as a transfer note marked still responsive, still aware and under no circumstances to be left alone. And a chill slid down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Because suddenly the question wasn't why the patient never died, but how long the patient had been awake after he had been declared dead. And from somewhere inside the vents above him, something shifted and dragged slowly, and for the first time all night, Dr. Ethan Miller felt absolutely certain that the hospital had been waiting for him, specifically not as a visitor, not as an explorer, but as a missing piece it had finally found again. Miller stood in the observation room with the logbook trembling softly in his hands, not because the room was shaking, but because he was, and he tried to tell himself that the appearance of his name in a forgotten asylum ledger was nothing more than coincidence, a clerical echo from a residency rotation he'd half erased from memory, but the words still responsive, still aware, coiled around his thoughts. Like something alive, and with a tired breath, he set the book down and turned slowly in place, letting his flashlight paint the circular glass window that overlooked the central ward, where rows of empty beds waited in a silence so thick it felt practiced. And that was when the lights all along the ward flickered at once in a lazy, uneven rhythm, not enough to fully awaken the space, but enough to show him that every bed now had restraints pulled tight, as if they'd been recently used and cut free in a hurry. And he let out a quiet, humorless breath and whispered, "Guess everyone checked out early tonight." And the sound of his own voice startled him with how small it felt. And somewhere beneath the floor, something answered with a dull metallic thud, as if something heavy had shifted its weight. And the idea crept in uninvited that the hospital wasn't just remembering him, it was rearranging itself around him. And he stepped back from the glass when a shape moved in the far corner of the ward, a slow, low movement, like a patient learning how to sit up for the first time in years. And he told himself it was a trick of shadow until the movement repeated closer this time, dragging across the floor with a wet patient sound that quietly peeled away the lie. And he turned and left the observation room without running again, because some mistakes feel less final when you walk into them, and the corridor he entered was narrower than before, the walls pressing inward just enough to make him feel like the building was narrowing its focus. And with every step, the sounds behind him multiplied. Soft dragging, soft breathing, faint taps against metal, as if fingers were learning the shape of cages. And he followed a faded exit sign that promised a stairwell, but every intersection seemed to rethread him back into deeper wings he didn't recall from the map, and the air grew denser, the sterile smell finally giving way to something acidic, like old burned plastic, and he realized with a quiet, slow dread that he was approaching the surgical wing. And that realization peeled open memories he'd worked very hard not to revisit, the first real mistake he'd ever made. the kind they don't teach you how to apologize for. And his pace slowed as he saw the familiar outlines of prep rooms and scrubbed sinks emerging from the darkness. Not abandoned the way the rest of the hospital felt, but paused like a paused video waiting for someone to hit play. And then without warning, one of the overhead lights snapped on, and the sudden brightness made him flinch. And in that slice of clinical white, he saw blood on the floor. Not fresh, not thick, but smeared thin in looping arcs that outlined the path of a gurney. And his feet followed the path against his better judgment, because guilt is a better guide than courage. And the trail led him into operating room 2. And the room was set exactly as it had been on the night patient 606 died to the instruments in their trays. The overhead light humming quietly, the monitor waiting. And in the center of it all, the operating table was clean, except for the faint outline where a body had once been. And the longer he stared at that outline, the more it began to look less like absence, and more like an impression, as if the table still remembered the weight of the person it had failed to surrender. And his chest tightened with an emotion that didn't settle on just one name: regret, fear, responsibility. They all layered together and formed something heavy and personal, and he whispered, "I did everything right." And the room answered by turning the monitor on by itself with a sharp digital chirp that made him jump. And on the screen, the familiar green waveform appeared, slow, imperfect, irregular, and the heart rate climbed just enough to say not dead and not alive either. And that was when he heard the voice again, not from behind him, not from the hall, but from inside his own skull, where memory and sound were starting to blur together. And it whispered, "You left too early," and he staggered back from the table as if struck, and the light above flickered. And for a moment the room transformed, and he wasn't an urban explorer standing alone in a corpse of a building. Anymore, he was a young surgeon again, with gloves tight around his wrists, sweat cooling under his mask, eyes locked on a failing heart, and the patient's face contorted in pain and fear and trust all at once. And the nurse's voice echoing faintly, "We're losing him, doctor." And in the memory, he made the same decision again, called the time again, stepped away again, and in this version, the body on the table turned its head to follow him and whispered through a broken airway, "You never even look back." And the illusion shattered when something slammed into the door behind him from the other side, hard enough to rattle the hinges, and the present rushed back in jagged fragments. The flickering light, the screaming monitor, the smell of iron and rot, and the second impact was closer this time. And he realized with a strange calm that the entity moving through the hospital was not patient 606 alone. It was every second that followed his decision, every unattended moment stretched and shaped into something that could walk. And he bolted then, not in panic but in principle, moving down the nearest hall that hadn't yet tried to convince him it remembered his face. And his breath came faster now, loud in his ears, drowning out the softer sounds that tracked him just behind and to his left. And as he ran, the hospital tallied itself open around him, doors swinging wide, lights blinking into brief awareness and shutting off again like a series of eyes opening and closing in lazy synchronization. And he passed the stairwell at last, but the steps were gone, replaced by a vertical shaft of darkness that exhaled cold air like a lung refusing to empty. And he kept moving and found himself in the old ICU wing, where privacy curtains hung in limp strips, and the beds were arranged in uneven lines, like abandoned chess pieces. And he ducked between them, slowing his breath, forcing himself quiet, because hiding is sometimes the only kind of control that feels available. And he crouched low near one of the far beds and waited. And for a few seconds, the hospital simply listened back, and then the breathing returned closer than before, accompanied now by the faint scrape of dragging restraints and the soft, wet clicking sound of joints learning motion again. And through a gap in the curtain, he saw it past silhouettes too many to count, stretched into overlapping limbs that moved with borrowed intention. And as it moved, the shadows in the room followed half a second behind, as if even the dark needed time to catch up with what it was seeing. And the voice threaded through the movement, not louder than before, not angrier, just more certain. And it said, "We waited for you," and Miller closed his eyes in the thin hope that sight was the final permission. The thing still required, but the hope drained quickly when he felt the air shift beside him, and the mattress of the bed behind him dipped slightly, as if someone unseen had taken a seat, and the familiar cold slid into his spine, and the whisper came again, warm against his ear. "You were always coming back," and in that moment he understood the shape of what was happening. that the hospital had not revived a single patient. It had been reheating a memory over and over, feeding it the time he thought he'd buried. And it wasn't hunting his body, it was reclaiming his ending. And with a sudden sharp clarity, he realized the only reason he'd been allowed to wander this long was because the place wanted him to see everything he had left unfinished. Miller stayed perfectly still as the invisible weight settled on the edge of the bed behind him, and for a strange, almost peaceful second, he imagined what it would feel like to simply let it take whatever it had come for, because exhaustion has a way of disguising itself as acceptance. But then the memory of the operating room returned sharp and bright and loud, and it cut through the fog like a blade, and he pushed up from the floor in one sudden motion, tearing through the curtain and stumbling blindly forward as the air behind him collapsed inward with a sound like lungs snapping shut. And he didn't look back this time, not once, because some truths are heavy enough without being witnessed. And he ran through ICU, past empty beds and dangling wires and flickering monitors that woke and died as he passed like startled insects. And the voice followed now, not only behind him, but beside him and ahead of him, folding over itself in slow, overlapping echoes, saying his name the way a patient might say it when the anesthesia begins to wear off, soft first, then afraid, then accusing, and the hospital tightened with it. Doors sliding shut just as he reached them, floors buckling upward just enough to snag his feet, and each time he fell, he felt the thing draw closer, not in a rush, not with hunger, but with a terrible, patient certainty, as if the outcome had already been charted and he was merely completing the final observable steps. And at the far end of the wing, he saw light, real light, not the tired, jaundiced flicker, but a pale gray promise leaking through a set of emergency exit doors that the map said should have been sealed. And he threw himself toward them, every muscle burning and every breath coming up shallow and sharp. And as his hand closed around the crash bar, the voice rose just enough to be heard over his heartbeat, and it asked in a tone that was almost curious, "Where will you go without your ending?" And the doors burst outward, and cold night air tore into his lungs so violently he nearly blacked out. But he stayed on his feet and staggered through into the overgrown courtyard behind the hospital, where dead fountains sat dry and cracked, and weeds choked what had once been careful landscaping. And he ran again across uneven ground, slipping once on wet stone, catching himself on a rusted bench. And when he finally collapsed near the perimeter fence, he realized with a disoriented shock that the sounds had stopped. No breathing, no dragging, no whisper, only his own gasping and the low, distant hum of the city beyond the trees. And he laughed once quietly without joy, because it felt wrong for escape to be that sudden. And as he struggled to his feet, he noticed the faint glow of his recorder still clipped to his jacket, light blinking patiently as it had inside. And when he lifted it to his ear, expecting static, or at least the echo of his own panic, what he heard instead was his own voice speaking clearly and calmly from earlier in the night, saying exploration log level, 6 northwest wing, and then layered beneath it, softer, slower, his own voice again, but warped and tired and unfinished, saying time of death. And his breath hitched as the two recordings overlapped and collapsed into one another, like the hospital had stitched them together. And the courtyard around him dimmed, not from loss of light, but from loss of depth, as if the space were gently flattening. And when he looked back at the building, he saw that the doors he had come through were no longer there, just blank concrete where the exit had been. And every window along the rear facade now reflected not the courtyard, not the trees, not the night sky, but the interior of the hospital, every hall and ward and room, displayed at once like a layered memory that refused to stay inside its frame. And in the highest window, the one that marked the level of room 606, a shape leaned forward slowly until its face pressed against the glass. And even at that distance, he knew the scar in the mouth and the eyes that no longer remembered light, and the lips moved in perfect silent synchronization, with the recorder still whispering at his ear. And he understood with a new sinking clarity that he had not outrun the hospital at all. He had only stepped into the outermost loop of it, that the courtyard, the fence, the trees, even the distant city noise were no longer true exterior, but part of the same stitched memory stretched thin enough to let him believe in space and distance again. And as if the place had finally grown bored of subtlety, the ground beneath him shuddered and tilted gently toward the building, like a pulse reversing direction. and the recorder went silent at last, and the voice returned not through the device this time, but through the air itself, soft and close and unbearably familiar, saying, "You signed for me once, doctor. Now it's your turn to stay responsive." And the courtyard lights blinked out together, leaving only the illuminated face in the upper window, and the slow, steady sound of a heart that refused to settle into either life or death. Miller stood at the edge of the courtyard as the world tilted inward toward the hospital. Like everything he had ever been was being gently poured back where it came from. And for a moment he tried to fight it in the small, stubborn ways humans always do, by digging his heels into gravel, by gripping the rusted fence until his palms split, by whispering no into the dark, as if the dark had ever cared about permission. And then the pull grew softer, not weaker, just more intimate, like a hand at the small of his back, guiding rather than forcing. And he felt himself stepping backward without quite deciding to, and the distant city noise thinned into a low underwater hum, and the courtyard folded away one layer at a time, until he was standing once again in the hallway outside room 606, with the chains restored and the warning fresh on the paint, as if the night had politely agreed to reset for him. And he let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and almost smiled at the absurd mercy of having another starting point. But the smile never finished forming, because the door was already open and the room inside was no longer dark. The overhead light glowed steady and calm and clean like an afternoon surgery slot, and the bed was neatly made, and the patient was sitting upright, waiting with hands folded and eyes no longer black, but tired and human and strangely gentle. And Miller stepped inside against every instinct, because curiosity has always been louder than fear in the long run. And the patient looked at him with an expression that carried no anger, now only a question that had aged for years. And finally the voice spoke without distortion, without accusation, and asked, "Do you know how long it is to stay awake when everyone else has decided your story is over?" And Miller felt the truth settle into him at last, that the horror had never been about death at all. It had been about abandonment stretched so thin it learned how to breathe. And he whispered, "I thought I couldn't save you." And the patient nodded slowly and said, "Maybe not, but you could have stayed." And the room grew warmer, not in temperature, but in memory. And the walls softened into the edges of the original operating room. And the distant beeping returned, not frantic now, but slow and steady. And Miller moved to the bedside on legs that felt almost forgiven, and took the patient's hand, and it was warm and solid and real. And the monitors leveled out, as if all they had ever needed was for someone to finally finish the night that had been left unfinished. And the hospital listened in silence as the last untreated moment found its shape again. And when the heart on the screen at last slipped into a long, unbroken line, it stayed that way peacefully, without panic, and the lights dimmed with a tenderness the building had never shown before. And in the final quiet, the patient squeezed Miller's hand once in thanks, and then the room was simply a room again. An old one, a broken one, but no longer a waiting one. And when the morning crew arrived weeks later responding to a storm-damaged door, they found two bodies in rooms 600 and 601, a long-decayed patient still strapped to the bed, and the other a man who had laid himself down beside it at some unknown hour, with no signs of struggle, and a recorder in his hand that contained only one final clean entry, made in a steady, calm voice that said, "Time of death recorded and accepted, and sometimes very late at night, when the city traffic thins and the hospital walls exhale their last echo of memory, a single window on the 6th floor glows softly and then fades, as if someone inside has finally finished watching for someone to return." And so as you settle deeper into the dark and let this story close its eyes in your mind, I'll leave you with one quiet question. Have you ever walked away from a moment that might still be waiting for you somewhere to come back and finish it?